I'm Mike from Radio Parts, and today I'm doing the training session on domestic RF basics. So I'm sure that you guys are all experts in it, but sometimes there's a lot of background in this field. It's I don't know, for me, very interesting. So we're going to cover a little bit of an intro to radio waves. So if you don't understand radio waves, it's pretty hard to understand the overall subject. Then TV antennas, differences in distribution. So we're going to have a look at the probably three main types of TV antennas. A little bit about AM, FM and DAB, but we covered that in the last training session or recently. And just how RF works. And a little bit about the mobile data too, because that's a big subject, of course, these days with the introduction of 4G and now 5G. So yeah. A little bit of background. I mean, it always amazes me how the mathematicians do this. And Tim, you were just saying that you're fantastic at maths. How do mathematicians come up with an idea that isn't even known in reality? And that was the case for electromagnetism. So the whole RF spectrum, no one knew anything about it. RF only really existed in lightning and in space. And so it really wasn't known until a Scottish guy by the name of Clerk Maxwell theorised it, and about 20 years later a German bloke by the name Hertz demonstrated it. Obviously Hertz we all know from 50 Hertz being our power and whatnot. Ian assures me that this is childish, but for me it's always funny if you grab a magnet. This is what I could find lying around the back of a speaker. And then you put it through a multimeter. So I've just got, just measuring the milliamps here. And when you run a magnet by it, you can actually see a current and a voltage appear. So obviously that's a concept of electromagnetism. So yeah, as it moves, this is obviously traveling at the speed of light. At least in a vacuum, it's traveling at the speed of light. And within the circuit, it's picking up the influence and creating a voltage and a current. So obviously, when we're watching TV, for example, these signals are all flying around in the air, and our antennas are picking it up, and our tuners are tuning into it. So it's kind of cool how it's wireless and kind of everywhere. In fact, even if you think about how we theorize about the Big Bang and all of that. I mean, that's exactly the same theory where you've got a whole bunch of radiation, background radiation, and we pick it up and we can deduce all kinds of things. So, obviously, the basic idea to pick that up, these are tiny little voltages as you're passing it through. So you're going to need an antenna to pick it up, and then you're going to need a tuner. So not that kind of mechanic tuner, but something that will resonate at that frequency, that will pick up that frequency and it will resonate. In this example, we've got an opera singer, breaking a glass. So the glass will have a resonant frequency, and when he hits the right note, bang, the glass will explode because it will start resonating at that frequency. So yeah, let's just have a look at the actual spectrum. So here we see the wavelength, and this is a critical thing for working out antennas. So from crest to crest, that's going to be your wavelength. So when we talk RF, this is all a part of an electromagnetic, part of the electromagnetic waves. And let's have a look at the full spectrum. So yeah, basically, as you move up through the spectrum, you've got radio waves, which will be our topic today. Then we move up through microwaves, infrared, visible light. Radio waves, they'll sort of, I guess the distance from the lower side of radio waves will be from crest to crest will be about the size of a football oval. By the time you're getting to the top of the spectrum for radio waves, you're talking about the size of a football. So we're talking big differences. By the time you're moving up through here, through microwaves, infrared, and by the time you're up to visible light, the wavelength is actually as small as a single bacterium. And then you go up into these X-rays and gamma, which are ionizing, kind of the stuff that you don't want every day to be exposed to. And down here, obviously, radio waves are harmless and, yeah, and very useful. So this is the range that we're talking about. So it's good to sort of understand the geography, I guess, of radio waves, where everything fits in, because it explains a lot of things, and we'll get onto that in a moment. As we move through radio waves, there's a part of the spectrum that's of particular interest, being the UHF part, and we stick a lot of stuff in this UHF part of the spectrum. You know, everything from our mobile phones to our CB radio to our marine radio, a whole bunch of stuff we'll stick there. Today's topic, we're really focusing on, I guess, TV reception, and that's in this category of ground waves. Obviously, you can have waves bouncing off the ionosphere. You can have, for your mobile phones, going up into space to a satellite and back down, or GPS. So a whole bunch of different characteristics. Yeah. In this demo, I've got a UHF radio as an example. We get plenty of customers that come in and think the bigger the UHF antenna, the more power I get. And again, it's good to understand that a larger antenna will have it's almost like a squashed balloon effect. So a larger antenna will be great for, say, open plains, great for a desert or something like that. But if you have a look at the characteristics of a short antenna, it'll be a more circular antenna. So in a hilly area, as you see here, a short antenna is actually going to outperform a long antenna. So if a four-wheel driver doesn't know exactly what environment they're going to go in, it might be open or it might be hilly, it might be a city environment, then a lot of the brands are offering two types of antennas. They'll give you, a base with a short antenna and a long antenna for that reason, just because the propagation characteristics are different. So these kinds of rules also apply to things like TV antennas, obviously. Also a good general rule, and it explains also a lot of things about cellular reception. Recently, 4G, well, fairly recently, 4G bought a whole lot of the spectrum, and the players, Telstra and Optus, bought a whole lot of the spectrum in the 700 meg range. The interesting bit is typically before then you'd have 2.6 or 2.1 gig, 1.8, 850, so these higher frequencies. And when they bought the lower frequencies, all of a sudden they could send their signals over a larger distance, just because the lower frequencies will travel further. And so as we see here, as you move down into UHF, the ability to, for example, get through walls is extremely good. We used to run a 2.4 digital headphone. We still have 2.4 gig digitals. They're beautifully clear, but if you compare them to the RF 900s, for example, lower down in the frequency, you're going to have a situation where the RF 900s will still outperform them in distance. So they'll get through more walls, travel a larger distance, just because they're lower down on the spectrum. We're stretching out those waves and they'll travel further. Obviously, there's complications to that. So in, for example, Wi-Fi, 2.4 technically would be the better frequency for Wi-Fi, but in the case of Wi-Fi, it's so crowded, the 2.4 gig range, that we kind of don't get the full benefit of the lower frequency. So if we're looking at TV, this looks a bit daunting, doesn't it? We've got a channel plan, obviously, here, and for every channel you'll have frequencies. And for frequencies, they'll fit within bands, and to make things more complicated, those bands will also have blocks. So you might have marine radio up here. This is a division between very high frequencies and ultra high frequencies, VHF and UHF. and CBs here. And once we get to the higher part of the spectrums, you've got your LTE around here. And we'll often stick a lot of our wireless mics around here. So we want to keep it, we have to keep it out of the LTE 4G part of the spectrum. But this is not actually channel block E or band 5 around here is not commonly used around Australia for TV. So that's why you'll have products like the DOS UHF 101 that we stick at the higher end of the spectrum. A lot of the TOAs also for wireless mics. The whole idea behind this is, you know, you don't want to have TV and mics on the, you know, on the same frequencies. A, it's illegal, and B, they'll affect each other. I did a little table that I'll show you soon about it also. So yeah, digital TV. So from the analog days, obviously we would have up to 69, and then we'd be using lower frequencies. So channel 2, obviously once upon a time was channel 2. But these days we clump them all together and we just run our TV frequencies from 6 to 51. Yeah, bands 1 to 5 and blocks. I kind of like talking about the blocks because in Australia, every transmitter will fit within a block, which is beautifully simple. So you've got Mount Dandenong here at block A. So they're all clumped together. So we've got FM radio, but basically 6 to 12, we've got all our channels on 6 to 12. So it's a nice narrow lump of products. And they're all horizontally polarized. So Mount Dandenong, boom, there. Our repeaters in Melbourne, for example, they're all on Ds, channel block D. So down, you know, Burke Street, down the road, they're channel block D. You know, South Yarra, for example, channel block D. So now the government's been quite smart in lumping those transmitters into one of these 5 categories. So when we program up a meter, like that ProMax, for example, we know that if we program in those 5 blocks, then we're going to have all of Australia covered. There's a few little caveats, like, for example, community TV keeps on hanging on, so there's a few little exceptions. All right. Yeah, this is a fairly big slide, this one. I really wanted to take TV reception from outside, from the transmitter, all the way through to the antenna, down through our distribution, through to the TV. So that's going to kind of be the order. So from outside, customers ask, well, yeah, how hard can it be? There are a lot of different influences. Metal's one of the big ones. You know, you always want to keep your antenna at least a meter away from another metal surface. So metal's not going to be your friend. So when you're mounting an antenna, that's why we keep it away from the roof. We stick it on a pole, keep it away from the metal. In the city, for example, you'll have plenty of cases where that signal, that RF signal, will be bouncing off a building and going in all kinds of directions. So the transmitter may be over here, but your antenna may be pointing completely in the other direction because it's coming in, bouncing off a building and hitting your antenna. So yeah, we'll show you the government website soon, but if the government website says point your antenna in this direction, you'll find in certain situations, no, you've got to point it in the other direction. Yeah, trees are another one. So you might just mount a TV antenna and it may be all working, but those trees may grow over time and you lose your reception. Those trees may get wet, that'll affect your reception. So there are kind of natural influences to your TV reception. That's when, you know, when you're setting up your TV antenna, ideally you use a meter to get it perfect. Otherwise, some small influences will mean that your signal will break up. And they're kind of those man-made things like 4G, for example. 4G is a massive one. So before 4G, it was so much easier getting TV reception. Then they set up all these repeaters around the place, and we're picking up huge amounts of power from 4G that influences our TV reception. So you'll find that a lot of the meters will show you a spectrum. So meters, well, any of the meters will pretty much show you a spectrum these days. And at the end, you'll see a spike, which indicates a 4G, and often you'll need a 4G filter to get rid of that, and that'll fix your reception. Meters, like professional meters like that ProMax over there, will do a LTE ingress test, and they'll give you a little more information on how 4G is affecting your antenna signal. But there could be other things also. There can be electric fences. So we've had cases where someone said, look, I've got perfect reception, except it drops at this time, and it's a time when the electric fence is going on. I had another case with a regional customer where the installer had mounted the antennas, but they were drooping down and they were facing towards a road, and he was losing reception around 8 o'clock in the morning. And it turned out, because the antenna was facing the wrong direction, every time the traffic started in the morning, he would lose reception because all the cars were interfering with his reception. So there can be man-made influences also. When you're setting up your antenna, obviously high is good for RF, but also a lot of installers will work horizontally. So, they'll get up on a roof with a meter, ideally, and an antenna like a log periodic, an antenna like this. So this antenna will pick up pretty much the whole spectrum, and it can be vertical, or it can be vertical, or it can be horizontal. So if an antenna installer goes up on a roof with this, he can basically know nothing about antennas and kind of point it and just work it out and pick up signal this way. So this will cover, the entire spectrum. Even FM, a log periodic will pick up a huge amount, and they'll move across the roof and try to work out an ideal place before they mount an antenna ideally. So log periodic is kind of a useful setup tool for an antenna installer. When you're working with UHF, that's more critical also. If you're working with VHF, so Mount Dandenong, you find that VHF is far more forgiving when you're trying to work out the placement of your TV antenna, just because of the propagation and the lower frequencies of VHF. But UHF, it's kind of critical. I just touched on this, but yeah, the antenna, the type of antenna that you use also. You got over here some rabbit's ears that I think we're selling for like $5 or something. It's a good starting point because, an antenna like this, it's basically a dipole, and that's all it is. And then you've got a little ballon to convert it to 75 ohms. So that's your antenna, and it kind of forms the basis of every antenna. So if you have a look at any antenna, they all have a dipole. They all have a dipole within them. You've got a dipole here, we call it a bow tie dipole. Here's another antenna. I've disassembled this one. But here you've got basically the same thing, your dipole here. And the log, technically, the design's a little bit different, but each of these elements will function more or less as dipoles. So that's kind of the first antenna, just a simple dipole. And then you have Yagi Uda, or Yagi, it's known as. So everyone would probably call this a Yagi. Kind of the unfortunate truth for an old Japanese guy by the name of Uda was that he was the guy who masterminded this nearly 100 years ago. And he had a little bit of help from Mr. Yagi, and Mr. Yagi seems to have got all the credit for it. So quite an amazing invention. So basically the idea of this is you've got your dipole here picking up, and then you've got a reflector down the back. So basically the idea is that you want it facing towards a tower. This reflector will kind of give it forward gain, or your back to front gain will be improved by having a reflector. So this will pick up a small amount of signal. With a reflector, the amount of signal is going to be drastically improved. And by having directors at the front, called parasitic elements, that'll also change kind of the shape of the signal from, a signal that might be fairly round to, you put your reflector at the back, and then when you put your directors at the front, your signal's becoming, I'm not going to finish that. Oh, that looks bad. It's going to start looking like more of a shotgun, a more directed signal towards a tower. Let's get rid of that. I don't want to get banned from YouTube. But the whole idea is that this will become more of a direct or a more direct signal towards a tower, which is good. So basically, a Yagi has the ability, when you've got your spectrum, it has the ability to be quite focused on one part of the spectrum, which I kind of like. So remember when we've got channel block A, B, C, D, E, you kind of don't want, you might have all this noise going on in the background. You don't want all of that noise. You just want one particular part. And if you want one particular part of that spectrum, then a Yagi is a really good choice. I'll keep on moving. So yeah, basically this is the only part doing the work. These parasitic elements are helping it direct it. And then the reflector, so if you looked at the signal, you'd have all this nice signal going out the front and just messiness out the back, so all the signal's directed towards the tower. So it's a very effective antenna. Built well, huh? Log periodic, you're seeing a lot more logs these days because, these guys are wide, very wide band. So you can have your band 3, 4, 5, so pretty much a whole spectrum. Band 2, you've got FM radio on band 2. Other than FM radio, there's not really much practical use probably for your customer for band 2. But even then, a log periodic will pick up band 2 fine, because it won't just cut off at 3, 4, 5. It doesn't really work that way. So this one will cover just about everything. These are Ficaro, so made in Italy. One of the, being log periodic, logarithmic. So if you have a look at the design and the placement of the elements, it's a logarithmic, and it's a split boom design. So what you have is a coaxial going up one end of the boom and then back down the other. So if you pull off this end, you'll either find that there'll be a bit of coaxial going around the boom, or you'll have a circuit board at the end. But basically it's coaxial up and down the boom. And then a little like the Yagi over there, each of these will sort of act as a reflector, and then you'll have your dipole, and then you'll have a director. But it's spread across the entire spectrum. And even if you want to work out lower frequencies are bigger elements, the way to work that out is you just need the speed of light, 300 kilometers per second, divided by, say, your frequency, so 150 megahertz, and then the half wave dipole. So yeah, if you go 2 times half, and then you get 1, so say 1 meter. If you increase that up to, say 300 meg, then you're going to get down to a half meter. So lower frequency, 150, we would have a big long element. By the time we're doubling that, we're going to have a shorter element. So thing to remember is, lower frequencies are going to be the longer elements, higher frequencies are going to be the shorter ones. It's kind of interesting when you look at 4G antennas, for example, you'll notice that they'll be a log design, which makes sense because they've got to cover a huge range of frequencies. You know how I told you that with 4G and mobile phone reception, we've got a huge range of frequencies from 700, we've got 850, 900, you know, we've got 1.8, 2.1, 2.6, all of these frequencies going all the way up. So if you're going to build a good antenna for mobile, then you're going to make sure that you've got probably a log, because you've got to cover all those frequencies. And these elements, you know, we're talking about the TV spectrum being at, say, channel 51. By the time you're getting up to those very high frequencies of, say, 2.6, these elements will be becoming very, very small. So you'll notice that they'll start off small and get extremely small and be quite long, covering the entire spectrum. So yeah, so for 4G or applications like that, a log is ideal. All right, and then we've got another log over here, which is a black arrow. One of the things also that we look for in antennas, and yeah, the one down here also, I'll just grab the directives. One thing that we look for is a very tough antenna. These days, if you get an antenna, the thing that used to always break was the bellin, you know, the connector. These days, an antenna will pretty much last forever. This one has a lifetime warranty, so yeah, if it ever does break itself, then yeah, you get a new one. Black arrows are pretty much the same, as in they just don't break. If you feel the elements, that's the kind of stuff that we look for, the thickness of the elements. So that manufacturer is out of Sydney. They make a whole bunch of different antennas. Most of them, you'll notice that the aluminium will be kind of thin. If you give it a bit of force, it'll bend. That one's a pretty damn strong antenna. Yeah, this one, Black Arrow, you've got a whole bunch of patents on this one, but one of the really interesting things is how they actually make or secure the elements to the boom. And I think they call it boom lock, but basically there's no crimping required in this antenna, making it an extremely tough antenna, this one. This one's made out of O'Sutherland Beach in South Australia. So a lot of our antennas are actually made in Australia. I mentioned the Ficaro that's made in Italy. The phase array over here is made out of China. Pretty much all phase array antennas are made out of China. That's the way it is. Which leads me on to the final antenna, being the phase array antenna. The phase array, yeah, it's an interesting antenna in that, yeah, obviously the design is quite different to the other ones that we've had a look at. So I probably should take it out of the packaging, but anyway. You've got your dipoles at the front, and then you've got this, it almost looks like a barbecue grill behind. And that's basically our reflector. You know how we had back there, we've got a longer element at the back, being the reflector. Yeah, they come in all different forms. You'll see UHF antennas, you know, with reflectors sort of like that. In this case, in phase arrays, it's just two barbecue grills behind. And that can be vertically or horizontally polarized, depending. These have a great characteristic of the dispersion. So we spoke about the Yagi design before, being directed towards a transmitter. The Yagi is, yeah, extremely focused and efficient. So if you add, it's a little thick, those ones. If you add more directors, the signal becomes sort of more in that shape. You add less and it's going to be more like that. A phase array, you actually get quite a wide, you can actually receive quite a wide range of signals, which makes it ideal for environments, say, for example, a city environment where you've got signal bouncing around the place. Often you'll find that a phase array will pick up signal very well, and it'll also discard all the junk behind it, just because of the design. So yeah, often in city environments, we use this. This one, you've got 2 antennas, obviously. So you're just increasing your gain or doubling your gain by having 2. We used to have these phase arrays with 4 for extremely low reception areas. But yeah, we just didn't sell that many because they were too big and bulky. So you'll find that phase arrays will generally be a single. And we've got a Hills single phase array, or you'll get a double. And the double, you'll find that the performance will be, yeah, very, very good. So there are 3 types of antennas, and there's variations on those antennas, of course. Yeah, and probably one of the points here also is that, yeah, obviously you've got a reflector at the back, which is 5% longer than the driven element, and then we've got the distribution ones that are shorter than your dipole or driven element. Any questions on that? All good? All right. So in most cases in Melbourne, we actually made this antenna for the majority of cases. I'll grab that. I'll grab the directors. So we made this antenna for the majority of situations in Melbourne, mainly because, as the name would suggest, a V36 4G, it's very much focused on Mount Dandenong, or the equivalents in capital cities, so those VHF type areas. It's tough, like the elements are very thick. Like I said, you're only going to buy an antenna ideally once. Yeah, lifetime warranty. It has 4G filter inbuilt also, because we find that in Melbourne, inevitably 4G is a big issue. I was just having a check of the 4G interference here, and I don't think we've got any towers around us, and we've still got 40 dB of LTE. So having a filter on every antenna is probably necessary. So yeah, and being a Yagi, we know that we're going to be focused on that Mount Dandenong and not on all the other stuff. So the majority of cases in Melbourne, this will cover it. It's neither a huge antenna nor a small one. So yeah, it's kind of in the middle. It suits just about all situations. Yeah. So, and like I said, it's made in Australia. So yeah, it's made specifically for our channel blocks and channel block A. So we picked our antenna. What happens next? So I figure that these are probably the steps. So number 1, you received your signal. You got your antenna here. Ideally, you'll use a meter and you'll measure the signal. I've got a meter set up here, and I don't know if I can pass this around. I'll try. It's good for you guys to have a look at these meters. If you have, just take a bit more of a look at them, because this will tell you everything that you need to know. And we have this in our workshop every day of the week. And I'll start it off here. So we can see our spectrum. So if we've got noise, for example, created by 4G, or you've got TV or whatever else, you'll see it on the spectrum. So certainly a useful thing. Here, we tend to use this kind of stuff for, if we're using modulation, or we want to check into any details of a signal. But probably this screen's one of the most useful. So we're looking at power. So power is measured in dB microvolts up here. So you can see with my dodgy little setup, we've got 39 dB of power. That's definitely on the low side. In the analog days, you'd be seeing a very hazy picture. Digital kind of likes low signal levels. So even though we're sitting at 39 dB, we're still picking up a picture without any pixelation, albeit the Pro Max tuner is a pretty good tuner. Yeah, you got the carrier noise. The other one that's probably of real interest is MER, so modulation error ratio. So MER is basically your quality of signal. And again, it's quite low at 19.5, but it's good enough. It's good enough to give us a stable signal. One thing to note, I find that dB is pretty much the same across all meters. If you have crappy meters or good meters, so your power is pretty similar. The difference with a good meter like this one and a crappy meter is that I shouldn't say crappy meter, a low cost meter. A low cost meter will measure up to about 80, 85 dB. If you go beyond that, they'll crap themselves. Pro Max, you can go 100, 105, 110, go crazy. So particularly for customers that are using bigger jobs, they need to have high power, and then they'll work down the line. Having a better meter is certainly very helpful, because then you can manage your power throughout the job. And I'll explain a bit more about that soon. MER, on the other hand, does tend to differ from brand to brand. So once you get a meter, you'll get familiar with what's acceptable and what's not. So yeah, on a modulator, you'll see those MER levels will be, for example, 37 and above. This measures up to 37. A meter like this one, while I'm here, I'll quickly show you. You can switch from terrestrial, in the case of this meter and many meters, you can switch to satellite. And down here you can see the familiar sign of Foxtel. So yeah, Foxtel being IQ3 and IQ4 being satellite. Yeah, a lot of installers, if they're just doing a quick setup of a Foxtel, they'll generally point the dish in the northerly direction, look for the fingerprint of Foxtel, and off they go. Job done. So yeah, I'll change it back to terrestrial. Yeah, so yeah, by all means, have a play with this meter. We use it all the time. Yeah. So once we've got our reading, we've plugged our meter into the antenna, and we've got a reading. And that reading, it might be 60 dB. You're fine. You'd check for LTE ideally. If it's got a filter on it, probably all good. If you've still got LTE, you might need to look at having, say, a 50 or 60 dB attenuator. Attenuation, if you guys are not familiar, that just means loss, really. But if it's, for example, 40 dB, 20 dB, then you'll need a masthead amplifier. So don't confuse masthead amplifiers with distribution amplifiers. They're two different things. So a masthead amplifier over here, most of the masthead amps that we sell are Kingrays. Having said that, we've got LCADs, and we put LCADs through the test, and they actually performed really well. So a masthead amplifier. Ideally, we spoke about Mount Dandenong, channel block A, VHF. Ideally, you'll get a masthead amplifier that will be for the correct thing. So a lot of installers might just go wideband and it'll just work for anything. It'll work better if you actually pick VHF or UHF. So what have I got in this case? We've got a wideband 35F. So wideband meaning that, yeah, probably not ideal, but it'll work across the whole spectrum. And 35 dB, be aware that obviously the 35 dB doesn't apply to VHF and UHF, but for simplicity's sake, let's just say that we're adding 35 dB of power. So don't worry about adding a masthead to that. And let's say we might be up to 75 dB or 55 dB. So that'll be more than fine for any of those situations. Kingray have mastheads specifically for digital TV that are very low noise, but because of their construction, because they're surface mount construction, as far as power supply goes, just make sure that those ones are always with a DC power supply, those ones. And you'll notice that their gain levels are very low, only 15 dB. 15 dB in digital world is absolutely fine. So you add 15 dB to that, you're bringing it up to 55 dB. That's plenty of signal, and it's very low noise, which is exactly what you want for digital. So yeah, so don't forget those digital amplifiers. Yeah, of the rest, so MHW, you'll have 25, 35, you'll have shielded ones. So if you've got, say, LTE or signal seeping in, it can oscillate the amplifier, so you might need to go a shielded one in the case of that. So that's your masthead amplifier. Once it's passed through the masthead amplifier, you've got to look at the rest of your job and how many points you have and what your distribution's like. So for example, if you've got a lot of TV points, yeah, you might need to plan it out. Maybe you're going at, an antenna up here running down to a splitter. It's a two-way splitter, for example. Say you lose, and you can look it up for each different product, but you might be losing 4 dB on a two-way splitter. And because you've got such a huge mansion, you've got an 8-way splitter here. And maybe you're losing 12 dB here. So you can start doing the calculations and thinking, actually, I've got the right amount of signal here, but I've got to compensate for all of this loss. And I'm going to make a bit of a loss along the cable also. So you might be thinking, I've got 20 dB of signal that I'm losing. For that, use a distribution amplifier. And yeah, there's a couple of examples. A lot of the residential ones will use the DWs, so the Kingrays, because they're pretty affordable, really. Or for the commercial jobs, we tend to recommend the Axing, a Swiss company. Why would a commercial job? Well, noise levels are a big issue, and these ones perform amazingly well, and they can also perform at very high levels. So we tend to recommend that one for your commercial. This one for your more residential. Kingray will hate me for saying that. And these ones are, for example, for trade shows, we'll use these, or as a band-aid solution. So a simple 1 in, 2 out, or 4 out, and that'll compensate for the losses that you have splitting, obviously. You also have other splitters. Here's one RL-RF380. So this one has an 8 out, and you've got a couple of inputs, one for TV and a couple of inputs, one for auxiliary and one for, say, a modulator. The interesting thing about this modulator, this splitter, is that you'll lose 20 dB in it, but it has an inbuilt amplifier of 20 dB. So when you're designing a job, the beauty of this one is you don't really need to account for those losses because it adds what it loses. When you're working with infrared, the other thing to remember is that diodes, so voltage will only flow in one direction. So infrared, if you've got an infrared target on the TV, say one of these by ResiLinks, it'll send an infrared signal back up the line, and if it hits a standard splitter, that voltage will not pass the splitter. So you'll have special splitters like this that will allow the voltage to pass through them. You've got other splitters like this Channel Plus that will allow the voltage to pass through them. So infrared, whenever you're dealing with infrared over your TV system, you've just got to have a second thought because you've got to consider that voltage. The other thing is if a TV's in the line and isn't using infrared, you're best off putting a DC blocker in there, because when you've got voltage running up and down the line, the TV will accumulate voltage and will affect its TV signal. So yeah, if that particular TV doesn't have an infrared target, stick a DC blocker on it and it'll stop the flow. The other thing also is that splitters, on a free-to-air, on a DOS splitter, for example, will mark which leg will allow voltage to pass through. So if that's sitting on your masthead, just below your antenna, your plug pack will probably be sitting in the living room. That's got to be able to send the voltage from the living room up through the splitter, through the right leg of the splitter, up to the masthead to power it. So when you're using a free-to-air splitter, just make sure that its power supply is on the correct leg of the splitter. If it's a satellite splitter, they'll be all ports power pass. So satellite's a bit different because a satellite box would normally be sending power up to the L&B. It'll be all ports. So for a satellite splitter, you don't need to worry, but free-to-air splitter, make sure that its power supply is sitting on the right leg of the splitter. Also the frequency range. So when I say free-to-air splitter, that's because it'll run typically up to a gig. Satellite splitters will tend to run up to either 2.1 or 2.4 gig. If you're working with Foxtel, make sure it's up to 2.4 gig because Foxtel for IQ3 and IQ4, they'll be 2.4 gig. When it comes down to splitting also, not this one, a tap. Yeah, you have things called taps. So taps, particularly for bigger jobs or commercial jobs, taps are really useful because what they will do is you can manage your losses. So if you've got your TV antenna running down and maybe it's going all the way down here, you've got a whole bunch of TV points along here and you've got lines going to all the TV points and then maybe a few more at the bottom. Typically what they might do is you might use a splitter here, a tap here and a tap here. So the idea is that you've got a certain amount of signal that you can afford to lose, and down here there's virtually no loss through a tap, but along here there'll be say a 15 dB loss. So that accounts when you want to balance up. So for example, we might say on these TV points we want 75 dB here, but we don't want less than say 40 dB down here. If you want to make sure that everyone's getting an equal amount of power, a tap can be extremely useful because by the time I get through here, maybe I lose only 1 dB through a tap, and maybe 1 dB down here, and then I've got a splitter where I might lose, 12 dB. So I can manage my losses by using a tap, whereas here we can afford to make losses because once we've gone through here, we're basically at the TV. So a tap will be, the through loss will be very minimal, and then the out to your level will be a higher loss. Does that make sense? Yeah? Yell out if it doesn't. So yeah, so we've got taps. Another question I also get, with modulators, how do you put a modulator in a system? A splitter in reverse is normally fine because we don't really need to worry about the voltages. So you'll just, a two-way splitter, but you reverse your ins and outs. So you can buy a combiner like this, like this Channel Plus, but what is unique about this is the diode part, not so much the fact that it can combine or split, because any splitter in reverse will work also. So in the case of a modulator and a TV signal, your TV signal comes in, modulator signal comes in, so it comes into your out on your splitter, and then your in on the splitter will just be the out to the rest of your TV system. So yeah, it tends to be pretty simple. All right. Now, a couple of other things also while we're talking about getting this signal in through the TV. I see cases also where people use PVC tape around the antenna signal. So the antenna balun is up there on the roof. They've screwed in the F-type and then they'll put PVC tape around it. Ideally, you'd use, your, what's it called? SST, self-amalgamating tape. SST, I think. Is that the code? Anyway, so basically this is a rubber material. So you tie it around the connector and it'll stick to the connector and it'll weather the environment, whereas PVC will become brittle and eventually fall off and not do its job. So make sure you've got the self-amalgamating tape on that connector. All right. How am I doing for time? not so good. All right. I'll absolutely fly through this. Yeah, just so that we know, because I think domestic RF without Foxtel is probably, we're not covering everything. So the first one is a simple job with a Foxtel IQ4, and you'll have a LMB with 2 outputs, and the 2 outputs can go straight into an IQ4, and the HDMI goes into the TV. Job done. The other way, which is really common domestically, is that they'll run the same kind of thing, but they'll run an HDMI out into a modulator, and then they'll run it through the TV system. Often they'll run it out into something like this, a splitter that will support IR also. And it means that all of the TVs in the house can watch Foxtel and they can control that Foxtel box. Now Foxtel, they have a special chipset, Broadcom chipset within it, which will play nicely with multi-stackers. So if someone's building a new house and they want to have Foxtel IQ4 boxes all around the place, then they'll run a LMB into the multi-stacker, and then that'll combine all of that signal into one cable. And that cable will go into one of the King-ray diplexers, and that combines the signal with your free-to-air signal, and then you go out to your various points. Every time you get to a TV point, you can use a diplexer. The diplexer will split your free-to-air and your Foxtel signal. So on that meter where I showed you guys Foxtel and free-to-air, that's because we've got a diplexer at the other end. So satellite into one, free-to-air into the other, so to combine the signal. If we make it a little more complicated, we're going to that. The Foxtel's going into this multi-stacker. This is a whole training session on its own, this multi-stacker. One cable's going out, and then we can split that signal using a King-ray splitter. The DOS splitters do work, but the King-ray splitters are Foxtel approved. One of the critical things is it's 2.4 gig, plus it passes all the performance specifications. So it goes to a splitter, and then when you get down to the TV point diplexer, split it back out so you get your TV and your Foxtel. And then we're going to a little more complex. So we're talking about taps. So we've got our Foxtel coming through the multi-stacker. We've got our TV going into the diplexer. And then in this case, we've got an amplifier because we want to boost up the signal. So this is a broadband amplifier. And that's running down to a tap here that's running out to all these TVs. And then the signal's running through to a splitter at the end, which runs out to a whole bunch more TVs. So that's a mansion, I guess, that place. But the same kind of rules apply in a commercial job. So once you know the domestic, you kind of know the commercial. So commercial, they don't use IQ3s or 4s, they have to use IQ2s. But the IQ2s will go into a modulator. In this case, we've got a 4-way modulator, 4 out, 4 in. And that goes to a splitter, which goes out to all the TVs. So we're converting it from that satellite signal to a free-to-air signal, which a modulator spits out, and then we're just running it out to the TVs. If we make it a little more complicated, we've got 10 Foxtel boxes going to 10 modulators. Now this is a special combiner from Zycast, a 12-way combiner. So that's combining all those modulators into one, and then we're splitting it out to the rest of the job. And here we've got a building. So we've got a multi-stacker, same one we use for skyrise, high-rise buildings as we do for residential. Goes into a multi-stacker. Here, we go down to here where it's split. It's split out. Why would you split it like that? Because you want to keep your dB levels equal. You always want to try to keep those dB levels as equal as possible. So we've split it out. And then it's going to a power supply, to a splitter for a 4-way splitter. Now this is not an ordinary splitter because that power supply voltage needs to go through the splitter and power one of these active taps. So you need the voltage to be able to go in the other direction. So make sure if you're doing a building, make sure that you use the splitters with the reverse voltage on them. So KSP4FRR in this case. And then they go out to these active taps. Now the beauty of these active taps is we can do enormous buildings with these because they've got their own gain on it. So, you know, all those losses that we're so worried about, it gets netted off with these because they've got their own gain. In Ben's description of his training, he had FM. I'm going to include it very quickly. So FM and AM, I mean, these are really the differences. You can see frequency modulated, amplitude modulated, AM radio. In Australia, they're set to continue ad nauseum. So FM and AM still very popular. And the other thing to remember is that, even antennas like this that are band 345, even those will pick up FM if you're in a low reception area. We do have specific FM antennas that are focused on FM channel 3. DAB, obviously we just had a training session on DAB, so I'm not going to cover it. In theory, if you wanted to, I mean, obviously we have the DAB antennas, but again, a log vertically polarized will pick up DAB radio, but ideally you'd use a DAB antenna. Why? Because ideally if you can focus on the correct channel, so if it's channel 9A, you want to focus on that, DAB antenna will do a better job. And that's a Focaro for memory. And again, you'll see it, dipole, reflector, and then you've got your director at the front. So the theory is all the same. Some quick ones. The MySwitch website, that's kind of useful for working out what antenna and where you should be pointing it. But obviously, local conditions will vary it. If you've got no reception at all, and you've tried everything, then you do have VAST in Australia, so you can plug in satellite, single LMB, and get a satellite box, and you can pick up TV that way. So myvast.com.au. The other one is, we spoke about TVs, and we didn't really speak about wireless mics, but whatever, wireless mics have got to sit on the channel block that's away from TV. So if you want to make sure that if you're setting up a wireless mic, you want to make sure it's not interfering with your TV, then the ACMA have a link here that you can go to that will tell you what channels are available in your particular area. If we go to the MySwitch website, I just chucked in the radio parts address here at 562, and in this case, it is now pointing straight towards Mount Dandenong, and you can see it gives you a whole bunch of information, you know, what channels, the polarization. We know Mount Dandenong's channel block A, and it will even give you the direction of where you should be pointing the antenna. Finally, the last part, a little update on mobile phones. So mobile phone reception, we're finished with 2G. This is the current state of play in 3G. 4G, it's looking like a mess, but they're always refarming frequencies and moving them across. So we're seeing a lot of the frequencies now appearing. These 900, for example, we're seeing them appearing over here. And we're seeing 5G starting to emerge, but it's actually emerging at quite a speed. So that's at 3.5 gig. There's been a little bit of talk about 3.5 gig. Well, that's C-band, you know, where a lot of people are picking up, you know, their foreign TV and whatever else. It'll be probably at the bottom part of C-band. So C-band for satellite, it'll be around that part. KU's where you've got your Foxtel and stuff, and VAST, that's all around the KU. So there's constantly a refarming of what available frequencies are. So that's it. That's a crash course into RF. Are there any questions or stuff that you guys have come up with? Weird stuff? I know it's a massively broad topic. Yeah, all good? All right. Well then, you're free to go. Enjoy your lives.